Hello, this is Odomne, and you're on the YouTube channel of the internet's most notorious ginger man, Thorin.
Recently, in the NBA media, with all this lockdown going on and people trying to go back through history and come up with interesting takes and different angles to keep people entertained and following the sport while you can't watch any of the actual games, some ESPN published a list of the greatest players of all time. And when I was reading down this list, it really made me think about how people evaluate the great players in League of Legends, because they tend to follow a similar rationale, probably because they've been primed by the way that sports media constructs the narratives around players and tells you who the best players are there. So the overwhelming, I would say almost depressing conclusion of this top 75 list or something was the sheer number of players where the main reason given as to why they were at that place in the list was the number of championships they won in a team sport. I mean, a sport even where in the modern day you even need to have a good bench, never mind even just having the best starters. And you aren't your own general manager, or you aren't your own coach, you aren't your own owner. So you don't always have power over who comes and joins your team in that respect. But they're treating it as though everyone had every variable was identical and just your players what determined your championships. Like, for example, probably the most egregious one was where they said that Wilt Chamberlain only had 2 championships. Like, do you know how many great players have 1, 2, no championships, but were truly incredible players, some of the best ever at their position? So again, their implication there is like, he had just the same teammates as Bill Russell, and Bill Russell won 11, so Bill Russell's significantly better than Wilt Chamberlain, ignoring the eye test, all other aspects. So when I was thinking about this, it basically ties into my pet peeve. I mean, I actually just think it ruins analysis, that people take greatness and they just skew it by forcing it through the prism of team championships. Now, it's not that team success isn't a result of individual play. If you're the best player on your team and you outplay the best player on the other team, as long as you have vaguely comparable teammates, yes, you can be the defining factor. You can potentially, in some scenarios, show you are better than him, not just individually, but even as a team carry and as a more influential component as a superstar player. Most of these players are superstar players, although I will say an obvious example, a player I love and I think defensively is god tier, was they had Scottie Pippen 21st player of all time, and they had loads of people below him who didn't have a Scottie Pippen, didn't have a Bulls level team, and who were much better star carries for their teams. Meanwhile, Pippen, when he was the star carry in 94, was certainly one of the best players in the NBA, but he wasn't an all-time great as the number 1 position. So why he gets his 6 championships and they're not counted as some of Michael Jordan's, or he doesn't get counted as like, maybe he gets like a third of those or half of them or something. I don't know how the fuck that works. But again, that's why it's so unfair about using championships. So it is that you can look at individual success and ask some questions. That's the thing. Every stat, like he won 4 championships, I always say the stat is the beginning of an interesting discussion. It's not the end. If it's the end for you and you go, well, he won 4, so he's better than someone who got 2, you don't know what you're talking about. You haven't even thought it through. The question as to why, when you say, well, he has 4 and he has 2, that should then spark an interesting discussion. Like, right, but who was more influential in those championships? What era did they play in relative to their individual level of play? How good were they, and how reasonable is it that this person got 4, this person got... Yeah, that's a great discussion. Maybe at the end you still come to the conclusion the guy with 4 is better, but that's a discussion. The other one is actually limiting all these massive spectrum of possibilities of discussion areas and ways and metrics of judging the players, and just saying, I'm going to make it simple. I'm going to go by who has the higher number of championships, and since I've made it a simple analysis scheme, I'm going to get simple answers. He's better, he's not. Well, it actually just lacks any, in my opinion, meaningful or qualitative analysis. It's purely quantitative based on the number of championships. So in a sense, yes, your championships, if you're a star player, are really important. But even then, everyone can't get equal credit for the championships they won, because you have to ask yourself, when you're chopping up the pie of who gets the credit for this championship, and in this case we're talking about the greatest players ever, so we're obviously talking about people who should be very influential on their championship, you need to start asking questions like, who was the main carry of that team? Who was the most influential? Sometimes that's not the main carry. Like the main carry of fucking FPX last year wasn't Doinby, but he was the most influential player in that team. So even though the carry would probably have been like Tian for me, or in terms of just raw damage, it would be LWX in a team fight, Doimby was the most influential player on the team, so that in itself makes it interesting, right? Who was carried? Sometimes you can be an amazing player and be carried by other lanes, other positions. Then it gets even more difficult when you have legit super teams that take top players at their positions from other teams and put them all together in one. G2 last year, and this year's an obvious example. Invictus Gaming that won at the 2018 championship, with the exception of Baolan, who even then on Rakan could look super sick. You're going to see now when Jackie Love's gone elsewhere, this was a super team. It wasn't in the traditional sense, but eventually it will be known as one. So that's one of the reasons why I came up with a concept that people in sports will sometimes allude to. Some of the more shrewd, nuanced commentators will say it, but the main big voices and talking heads almost never do this. And to my knowledge, they almost never actually analyze in depth in this way, because for mainstream consciousness, they want to make it simple so that simple people with simple view on the game can get involved, and then they can have their opinion, this, that, make it binary. He has more, he has less. Like in this kind of a scenario, I call this principle, the title of the video, I call it the Kareem-Magic factor. And if you don't follow the NBA, by the way, the obvious example, if you're an NFL fan, would be the Montana Rice factor. I think it's the same principle at work. Here's the basic premise, right? And we're going to tie this into League of Legends and break down some of the League of Legends teams. If you ask any expert in basketball, who's a TV expert, a media expert, even a great player, right, who's your top 10 NBA players of all time? Similar premise to the ESPN article, right? It is near 100% that everyone has Magic Johnson on the list. He's top 10 automatically. And in the vast majority of cases, most people, unless they're really, really new school, will have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar there. The highest scorer in NBA history, the guy with the most MVPs in NBA history, the guy with the bazillion fucking championships, did it the most years apart, like all sorts of amazing shit. So the thing is, these guys both have the championships. They both have the MVP awards. The eye test tells you they were among the best, if not the best at their role. They have the longevity. Magic less so, but even then he had some very good years, and obviously was a banger as a fucking rookie. They're arguably the best at their roles during their career. But when it comes to being champions, though, how can you judge them each separately and talk about the championships they won and ignore that they both played on the same team, and that Magic Johnson, often considered by many people on their lists the superior player, won 100% of his championships playing with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So effectively, in the top 10, every other player, whenever you go and look at these lists, are players that didn't play with each other. Like maybe like someone like Charles Barkley, it's more of a rare fringe pick. Might have like Oscar Robertson, and he did win his championship playing with Kareem. So sometimes you get some of that. But generally, every other name on the top 10 played, and then their number two, their sidekick, their other best player, isn't even top 10, isn't even top 20. And then you have Magic and Kareem, who are getting full credit for all their championships, and they played together. And some people, by the way, have those two top 5. And that's never factored into it. It's never asked, well, isn't that unfair that we do? It's never even considered. So in League of Legends, let's take this same principle and apply it to some of the teams with really big star players, big names, but who played together. And so to judge them, if you want to judge Xpeke versus Froggen, right, I can talk about the eye test of them, I can talk about who's better, but if you're going to make it about championships, immediately the obvious counter I can use, which you're going to have a hard time arguing against, is, yeah, but Xpeke had Soaz and he had Reckless. Wouldn't you consider those some of the GOATs of their positions as well? Most people would, right? Where's Froggen's GOATs of his positions that play with him? Exactly. So when you look at the Fnatic 2014 is the best example to me, the one where they had Soaz still in his prime, able to play. I mean, at this point in time, he had to go more towards tanks, but he could still bring out, obviously, all those crazy, weird counter matchup picks up that no one had ever played before. It's still a very good player, could use teleport and work with Xpeke in that way, when there wasn't much flexing, but they could still do it in their team. You had Xpeke, an amazing carry, when he would get the right champions, when he could play assassins, he would dominate the game, massive pop-off player. And then you had Reckless, who in terms of like, as just go through the lane and then get to a team fight, and if you then, at that point in time, have the damage and the items, you're able to win the game. People were saying Reckless was the MVP. He won the MVP in the split where Froggen hard carried the Alliance team that started off dog shit and almost took them to the championship. So people were saying Reckless was the MVP here. And again, he was always an MVP voting for years and years and years. But I look at that team was defined first and foremost by Xpeke. Then Soaz would be the sidekick in this scenario. I'm just making an NBA analogy here because of how incredibly versatile he was, how he synergized to make Xpeke better, how he could play without resources. And then Reckless was someone who was basically the tertiary carry. He was the insurance policy for if they haven't already won the game off the other shit. Remember, they won championships and were going to Worlds and top 4 without him. he was the insurance policy. At this point in time, he hadn't blossomed into the player he became in Season 7 summer, Season 9 spring. Some of the later splits in his career where he was the main carry, he was the guy you played through, put your resources to, and sometimes even played his lane hard. So in that scenario, it's already a problem for me that you're going to say Soaz gets all his championships. Because, yeah, he gets some of them, but he had expected, didn't he? And he certainly wasn't putting all the resources through himself. But the idea Reckless gets all his championships, and that he was the best player here, and then you can mock a Forgiven, a Freeze, because they didn't have Soaz expected. That seems that seems like cruel and unusual punishment or analysis in this particular case. And it's whack. It doesn't actually get down to the making any kind of interesting qualitative judgments about the players and their careers. It just says, Reckless won more championships, so he's better, like that stupid post he once made where he tried, to be fair, if he was just bantering, fair enough, when he bantered Freeze when they were going back and forth. Then we'll go and look at the TSM team, the one that was in Season 6 and Season 7, where the star players were, of course, Doublelift and Bjergsen, right? Again, why was Bjergsen automatically better than Jensen in everyone's mind? Because he was winning the championship, right? Ignoring that Jensen, he didn't have a Doublelift on his team. At the time, he had Impact. It's not a superstar player. In fact, it's a weak side player. He had Sneaky was his AD carry. Now, you can argue all day long because of World's performances and certain playoff runs. Yeah, Sneaky in his right meta was a pretty good player. He's definitely above average AD carry at times. Sometimes he was bordering on the best a couple of years before this. But the idea that like Doublelift and Sneaky are fair players to compare, and that we're going to again give Doublelift and Bjergsen both all the championships, and then we're going to say, sorry, Jensen, you just can't be as good because you can't beat two superstars with your 0 superstars and just one. Like, fucking give me a break. So then let's not even get into the angle that at the time people would, if I'd have made this video then, have gone, how dare you leave Hortzer out? He should be a superstar player. He is the best NA top. I already told you at the time, if you looked at the way he was playing, he wasn't. He himself benefited from this Kareem-Magic factor in the case that he was fucking James Worthy in this equation. And imagine James Worthy going and talking shit to someone like another small forward. Like, imagine him going up to, let's pick a small forward who won like one championship or something. One who won no championships. Let's say like Alex English. The idea James Worthy's better than Alex English is he fucking bullshit. Go watch the NBA. Go watch the history of the game. Look at the teammates they had, the GMs they had, and how their careers went. Is he fucking shit? Alex English, significantly greater player. So then, now, obviously, no one would even say Hortz in that equation. Then go to the G2 team of 2019, right? Now, in this team, I'm putting the superstar names. I actually think they had 4. I think that's one of the greatest super teams ever because Perks was a superstar before an MVP. Caps was a superstar and an MVP. Wonder was one of the best top laners in Europe, arguably the best when he was in Misfits. He was questionable for it. Then when he was in G2, when they had the Yana Wadid bottle, he was incredible. Then they had Jankos, who'd been the best jungler in Europe for years and years, sometimes unacknowledged, but he was always up there. Right? These people are godlike. Now, Mickey X had times and ways in which he looked pretty good. He was good in lane, but, he didn't have the right teams. He definitely wasn't considered like far and away the best, like support. That whole angle was more of a fringe, like analyst take. So I don't count him as that because in a super team sense, he became the super team player in this team, not coming to the equation. So now you've got 4 massive names, all contending, at times even the best in their role in this G2. How do they divide the championships up? Like, how do we equate this? This is one of the reasons why I actually thought in Season 9 summer, actually Veteran was on point. I think Hillisang was the MVP because you look at who he was working with, and then you look at who Mickey X, Caps, but these people, it was almost unfair to contrast them and just look at who won the championship. Then actually, let's go back to when Caps was in Fnatic, right? At the time, especially once you got to the summer, when you went to Worlds, at the time, right, Whipple was mega influential, but you had Caps in the mid lane, contender for best player in the world, and then you had Reckless in the bot lane, and certainly he was doing a very good job. That was one of the ones where for me he was kind of, this is when he'd come back and they'd stop playing funnel. At times, he was basically someone who was almost between a guy being carried and a guy doing the carrying, as he often has been in terms of Reckless. He's been that quantum super state carry in some regards throughout his career, because it almost feels like it's based on how he wakes up and feels during that split and about his champion pool. So, again, who gets the credit there? Now everyone's going to give most of it to Caps and Reckless. Everyone loves to hate on Bwipo. At the time, everyone was shouting from the rooftops about how god tier Bwipo was and how obviously you should play him over Soaz, or Soaz is washed, or he's only a tank player or whatever. Like, this is another example of how we got to be very nuanced when we're breaking these guys down. It's not as simple as one is the best at all times. That's the other thing. So even though in this equation, I've kind of laid them out and a number of them I've kind of done that way, I think the G2 one is the best example. In the G2 one, I genuinely think if you look at it, in the spring, I thought that I agree with Papa Smithy. Wonder was incredible. You can make a case for Caps as well. It's between those two. Then you come to summer, it's all about Jankos just saving everyone's arse. Perks gets really good. Like, that's big time shit. We've already now literally had all 4 of them take turns to be the best. This is ridiculous. So I think in this scenario, this ties into my concept about how much help did you have in terms of your teammates. So, for example, that's why I actually give a lot of credit. I give bonus points to players like Forgiven, Kabashard, where they didn't have the same level of teammate at all, but contended with and sometimes were considered better than the guy with the super teammates who sometimes carry the team, who get all the plaudits and get the championships and are considered greater in that regard. So when it comes to dynasties, teams that have had this great success, many championships, again, you've got to divide it up by the great players and figure out where they were in this equation. So, for example, Michael Jordan, he's a truly great player, right? Now, here's the interesting thing. Despite the fact they put Scottie Pippen 21 on this list, realistically, Scottie Pippen shouldn't even be in the top 30, top 40. Like, it just doesn't make sense with how his career went. He's an extremely good number 2 player. He's a fantastic defender. His all-around game and court vision is amazing. I think he actually was essential to winning, but it was mainly about Michael Jordan and those teams. And Michael Jordan, in some ways, he actually got extra credit because he took 2 players who were really good but weren't like gods of their position. So Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman, they're not top 20 or top 40 or even maybe even top 50 players of all time at this point. But because he had 2 of them and they were like just outside that sort of a range as players at their positions, he got away with it being like, well, he didn't ever have like a superstar number 2 like Kareem-Magic. So even then it's difficult, right? You can't just give them all to Michael Jordan. He kind of did it by committee with the rest of them. Now, that's an extreme version. It's very rare that that's going to happen. But generally, let's consider overall teammate strength. Like, even though, unfortunately, all-star selections nowadays are political, and definitely in the latter days, like Kevin Garnett, Kobe, they still get the all-star selection when they're far from the best at their role, and by metrics of performance, qualitative analysis, they shouldn't be getting those roles. That's why I don't want to use all-star selections to see who had the best teammates, even though it's another media thing. Since coaches are involved, I'd prefer like all-pro. I think that's more realistic. That's not a bad thing to gauge how much help someone had, and then maybe use as some sort of a ratio, a thing to attenuate how many championships or how great a player who won X championships was. Because think about it, right? If you want to talk about the best teammates, right? Well, yeah, Kareem had Magic, right? Bill Russell, you know what? Everyone's going to say he had nobody. He had people who sometimes were scoring more points than him in the team. He had fucking Sam Jones, a guy who won a Brazilian champion. He had loads of people. He had Bob Cousy at one point. He had some other, again, by committee. But they don't get any credit for those championships, like just Bill Russell does. Then you have Larry Bird. Right, Larry Bird was in kind of the scenario a bit like the Michael Jordan one. He had Kevin McHale, he had Robert Parrish, he had some amazing players, but again, who weren't the prime alpha carry, and they aren't going to be put on these lists. They're going to be way, way down them. But again, fantastic players. Shaq and Kobe had each other, right? Shaq then had Dwayne Wade. Tim Duncan, he also had like the couple of people who weren't going to be the best. They were contenders for the best of their role in Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker. Wilt Chamberlain, until he got to the later teams when he played with the Lakers, didn't have that many of the great players at all. Like, he had people who were good and in their own way, because they won championships, Wilt Chamberlain are considered like pretty good players in history, but then none of them are even approaching these. They're all forgotten in history. Yeah, later with the late 60s, early 70s Lakers, he had some superstar teams, but even then, some of them were not fully washed. I mean, Elgin Baylor was fairly washed when Wilt Chamberlain got there, but they weren't at their peak. And then again, when they then win the championship, win every game, and won that amazing streak of games, who gets the credit, right? Then you have a player like Hakeem, who I think actually historically, he only got the great players at the end of their career, and even then they weren't the GOAT players. I mean, I actually think Charles Barkley was underrated, but not in that period when he went to the Rockets. So the fact that Hakeem wins 2 championships, in some ways, I think he's better than some people who were the second or third option who won 4 or 5. Oscar Robertson only really had Kareem for those few years, then played amazing basketball but didn't have the teammates. So here's the thing. If you've understood the factor I'm talking about here and the different lens that it puts on examining great players and figuring out their team success and their championships and how their team is made up, now take this and perform this thought exercise whenever you analyse the best player now, in your opinion, and the best player at his role, because sometimes you can have multiple players on a team that are considered best at their role. So the great players in history, you have to ask yourself, how are we going to analyse these great dynasties and give them credit and who gets how much of it? It's not just about the narratives. This is a more complex analytical tool which can yield more complex results, but as a result, I find those, in some senses, more interesting. This video was kindly supported by Alexander Rao, Dean Tanglis, Emanuel Särnbratt, JDubs, NateDOhDoubleG, the Puyallup Tribe, Tobias Bernasconi, Xinged, and a special thanks always goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my shows? Maybe ask a question in my monthly video AMA? Do you want teasers? Who are the guests on my next content? Maybe you want to take part in one of those donated discussions with me where we go really deep into the weeds. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today in the description box link below.